The diner was a symphony of chaos. The sizzle of the grill, the upbeat jingle of the jukebox, and the tired laughter of the late shift workers. But at table 8, the air was heavy with a different kind of energy. Lee Gun-woo, the man they called the Korean Dragon, sat in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. He wasn't there for the coffee. He was there to settle a blood debt with men who had spent months trying to put him in the ground. But before his contact could even speak, something white and soft brushed against the toe of Gun-woo's expensive Italian leather shoe, a heavy cotton towel. He looked down, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon concealed beneath his blazer. He expected a threat. He didn't expect the shaky, jagged letters written in a child's hand. One word, help. Gun-woo slowly raised his gaze. In the center of the room stood Lucia, a small girl in a pink dress that seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, her deep brown skin pale with shock, her eyes red and weeping from a trauma no child should know. She stood frozen, her tiny fingers digging into the hem of her dress. Behind her, a man with a jagged scar and a heavy leather jacket didn't just have a hand on her shoulder. He had a grip like a vice. Possessive, ruthless. The waitress, Dorotha, bustled right past them, her mind on her tips and the closing hour, completely blind to the silent war being fought in that little girl's eyes. But the dragon didn't miss it. Gun-woo's fingers curled around the towel, his knuckles turning white, crushing the fabric like the throat of an enemy. Lucia had scanned the room and made the most dangerous choice possible. Of all the people in this diner, she had reached out to the one man capable of turning this greasy spoon into a blood-soaked fortress. When Gun-woo stood up, his own bodyguards, men who had seen him survive hits and street wars, didn't move. They froze, because for the first time in 10 years, they saw something in Gun-woo's eyes that wasn't just cold business. It was a promise of total annihilation. Stay with me until the end, because the decision made at table 8 is about to shatter a global trafficking ring and reveal why this little girl chose a monster to be her savior. Before we get into the fire, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were the only one who saw the note? Lee Gun-woo did not look at the scars in the mirror anymore. To him, they were not wounds. They were a map of a city that had tried to swallow him whole and failed. The jagged line running from his temple to the edge of his jaw was a souvenir from a rain-slicked alley in Busan, a gift from a mentor who had traded loyalty for a suitcase of untraceable bills. The puckered mark near his collarbone was the remnants of a sniper's breath in Seoul. Every inch of his skin was a ledger of debts paid in blood and secrets kept in bone. He had survived by becoming more machine than man, a creature of cold calculation who viewed empathy as a fatal technical error. In the underworld, Gun-woo was known as a man who could walk through a fire and come out holding the match. He had built the Dragon Syndicate on the ruins of his own youth, replacing his heart with a clockwork mechanism of strategy and steel. His power didn't come from the gold on his chest or the men at his back. It came from his ability to look at a human being and see only a variable. He had watched empires crumble and families dissolve with the same detached interest one might show a passing storm. To Gun-woo, the world was a predatory machine, and he was the apex of its design. But as he sat at table 8, the fluorescent light of the diner caught the ridge of the scar on his cheek, casting a shadow that made him look like a relic of an ancient war. He had come here to finalize the White Peace, a treaty with the very men who had once ordered his execution. It was a deal worth millions, a move that would solidify his legacy and ensure his name was whispered in boardrooms rather than shouted in backstreets. He was seconds away from the ultimate victory of his career, a moment where the monster finally became the king. Then the towel hit his shoe. The weight of it was nothing, a mere fraction of an ounce. Yet it felt heavier than the lead that had almost taken his life years ago. Gun-woo didn't just see the word, help. He felt the jagged vibration of the hand that had written it. It was a frequency he hadn't tuned into for decades. The raw, unfiltered signal of a soul that still believed salvation was possible. He looked at Lucia, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the scars on his face ached. They didn't ache with the ghost of old pain, but with the sudden, sharp realization of what they truly represented. Every time he had been the one who needed help and found only a blade. He saw her red, weeping eyes, and in them, he saw the reflection of a boy standing over a father's body in a pizzeria decades ago. The boy he had buried under layers of ink and violence stared back at him from the face of a terrified girl in a pink dress. The men behind him, his background, sensed the shift. They didn't need to see the note to know the air had changed. The atmosphere in the diner curdled, the casual chatter of the other patrons becoming a distant, muffled hum. Gun Wu's pulse, usually a steady, glacial thrum, began to accelerate. The dragon wasn't just waking up. He was remembering why he had grown claws in the first place. He folded the towel with a slow, deliberate grace, hiding the plea within the palm of his hand, and felt the old, cold fury rising, not for his enemies, but for the man he had become. The pink of Lucia's dress was a violent intrusion in the drab, grease-stained reality of the diner. It was the color of birthday parties and Sunday mornings, a shade of hope that had no business existing in a room filled with men who traded in misery. Up close, the fabric was frayed at the edges, dusted with the grit of a long, forced journey. But it was her eyes that held Gun Wu captive. They were a startling, vibrant blue, now swimming in a sea of broken capillaries and raw, red exhaustion. It wasn't just crying that had done that. It was the physiological toll of a body that had forgotten how to sleep, a mind trapped in a permanent state of fight or flight. She stood like a statue carved from coal and candy, her deep brown skin contrasting sharply against the neon pink sleeves of her dress. Every time the door chimed or a plate clattered, her small frame jolted, a silent tremor that started in her braided hair and ended in her white-knuckled grip on her own hem. She was a master of the invisible scream. To anyone else, she was just a tired child out late with family. To Gun Wu, she was a siren wailing on a frequency only he could hear. Surrounding her was the darkness. 3 men sat at her table, their presence a physical bruise on the environment. They wore heavy leather jackets that smelled of old tobacco and road salt, their faces etched with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from viewing people as units of currency. The man directly behind her, the one whose hand was buried in her shoulder, was the worst of the triad. He didn't look at his food. He looked at the room with a flat, predatory gaze, his thumb rhythmically digging into the soft tissue of Lucia's collarbone. Not a caress, but a reminder of the leash. The visual dissonance was sickening. The thugs were shadows, jagged and formless, while Lucia was a singular point of light being slowly snuffed out. They leaned in close, their low, guttural murmurs acting as a wall of sound that isolated her even in a crowded room. One of them reached out with a grease-stained finger to mockingly tuck a stray braid behind her ear. Lucia didn't flinch. She simply went hollow, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she could disappear into the linoleum if she only wished hard enough. From table 8, Gun Wu watched the way the light died when it touched the men in leather. They were small-time predators, the kind of bottom feeders who thrived in the cracks of the city he claimed to rule. They thought they were invisible because the rest of the world chose to be blind. They didn't see the dragon watching them from the periphery. They didn't notice the way his men in the background had stopped eating, their forks resting silently on their plates, their eyes locked on the back of the thugs' heads. The contrast was no longer just a visual observation. It was a moral ultimatum. The pink dress was a flag of truce in a war Gun Wu hadn't known he was fighting. Every second he sat in silence, the darkness of the leather jacket seemed to spread, threatening to swallow the small, vibrant girl whole. Gun Wu felt the towel in his pocket, a tiny piece of evidence that the world was still worth saving. The dragon's eyes narrowed, shifting from the girl's trauma to the captors' throats. The time for observation was over. The time for the hunt had begun. The moment was a fragile thread, pulled so tight it hummed. Lucia knew that in the world of the men who held her, movement was a crime and silence was the only currency that bought another hour of breath. But as she stood there, the weight of the white towel in her hand felt like a mountain she could no longer carry. She didn't look at the man behind her, whose fingers were still a cold, heavy weight on her shoulder. Instead, she looked at the reflection in the dark window of the diner, a ghostly image of the man at table 8. He was a statue of ink and scars, but his eyes were the only things in the room that didn't look through her. With a slow, agonizing precision, Lucia let the towel slip from her trembling fingers. It didn't fall. It drifted, a white petal descending into a pit of vipers. It hit the floor without a sound, landing softly near the toe of her scuffed shoe. The man in the leather jacket shifted, his chair creaking like a warning shot. He began to look down, his predatory instinct sensing a break in the pattern. In that heartbeat, Lucia's breath hitched. If he saw the word written in that jagged, desperate hand, the pink of her dress would be the last thing she ever wore. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. With a courage that belonged to someone 3 times her age, she executed a tiny, rhythmic motion, a soft nudge with the side of her foot. It was a kick born of pure desperation, sent with a silent prayer to a god she wasn't sure was listening. The towel slid. It glided across the linoleum, weaving through the forest of chair legs and the spilled salt of a previous diner's meal. It moved like a living thing, a messenger crossing no man's land under the cover of a casual dinner. Gunwoo watched the white blur approach. He didn't move a muscle, his expression a mask of bored indifference that hid the storm brewing beneath his skin. He saw the lead captor's eyes scan the floor, missing the towel by a mere inch as a waitress hurried past with a tray of steaming coffee. The timing was a miracle of seconds. The towel finally came to rest, touching the tip of Gunwoo's boot. It was a bridge built of fabric and fear, connecting the most innocent soul in the room to the most dangerous. The tension in the diner reached a fever pitch. Lucia's eyes met Gunwoo's one last time, a silent plea that screamed through the silence. She had done her part. She had thrown the flare into the dark. Now, she stood perfectly still, her small hands hidden behind her back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man behind her tightened his grip, pulling her an inch closer to the table, oblivious to the fact that the package had just sent a distress signal to the only man in the city capable of answering it. Gunwoo felt the soft pressure against his foot, and the cold void in his chest began to fill with a terrifying, righteous heat. The slide was over. The war had begun. Gunwoo did not look down immediately. He let the towel linger against his boot for several seconds, allowing the rhythm of the diner to reset. Across from him, the representative of the rival faction was mid-sentence, his voice a low drone detailing the split of territory in the northern docks. It was a conversation worth millions, a verbal contract that would dictate the future of the city's trade. But for the first time in his life, the numbers didn't add up. The air around table 8 had grown cold, stripped of its corporate pretense, leaving only the raw scent of the hunt. With a movement so fluid it appeared accidental, Gunwoo crossed his legs. As he did, his fingers caught the edge of the towel, scooping it upward into the shadows beneath the table. He brought it into the light with the practiced grace of a man checking his watch. The fabric was rough, a cheap industrial weave that felt like sandpaper against his scarred palms. He unfolded it slowly, peeling back the layers of fear until the purple wax of a crayon mark was revealed. Help. The word was small, the H trailing off into a shaky line where Lucia's hand must have faltered. It was a single syllable that carried the weight of a death sentence. Gunwoo stared at it, his eyes narrowing into thin slits of black glass. Beside him, his rival tapped a gold pen on the table, impatient for a signature. Gunwoo, the docks. Do we have an agreement? Gunwoo didn't answer. He didn't even look at the contract. The $1 million deal, the political alliances, the white peace he had spent months brokering. It all dissolved into gray ash. He felt a familiar, ancient pulse thrumming in the scars on his neck. It was the predator's instinct, a dormant beast that had been fed on a diet of betrayal and now hungered for something far more primal. He wasn't Lee Gunwoo, the businessman, anymore. He was the dragon, and someone had just dared to bleed in his shadow. He looked up, his gaze bypassing the men at his table entirely. He locked onto the back of the leather-jacketed man at table 12. He began to dissect the scene with surgical precision. He saw the way the man's elbow was positioned to block Lucia's exit. He saw the tension in the man's jaw, the subtle bulge of a 9mm under the left arm of the jacket. He noted the two partners, one watching the door, one watching the kitchen. They were professional, but they were arrogant. They thought the man at table 8 was too busy counting his money to notice a missing girl. Gunwoo crushed the towel in his fist, the purple crayon mark disappearing into the depths of his palm. He felt a strange, terrifying clarity. The flaw of his nihilism, the belief that nothing was worth saving, cracked and shattered. If the world was a machine, then these men were the grit that ground the gears, and he was the one who would break them. He leaned back, his chair creaking with an ominous finality. He signaled to his men in the background, a slight tilt of his head, a sharpening of his eyes. They didn't reach for their weapons yet, but the stillness that settled over them was more terrifying than any draw. The deal was dead. The hunt was on. Dorothy Green was a woman who lived by the rhythm of the clock and the heat of the kitchen pass. She moved through the diner with a weary grace, her mind already halfway home, calculating the tips tucked into her apron. She didn't see the jagged scars on the men at table 12, nor did she notice the way the air seemed to vibrate around Lee Gun-woo. To her, Lucia was just another quiet child, perhaps a bit too pale under the fluorescent hum, but Dorothy had seen 1,000 tired children in her 20 years of service. She balanced a tray of heavy ceramic mugs, her path taking her directly between Gun-woo's predatory gaze and the leather-clad men holding Lucia captive. She was seconds away from a catastrophe she couldn't comprehend. As she leaned in to refill the water glasses at table 12, her hip brushed against the lead trafficker's shoulder. The man's hand twitched toward the steel hidden beneath his jacket, his nerves frayed by the proximity of the dragon. He looked at Dorothy not as a waitress, but as a witness who was getting too close to his cargo. The violence was a coiled spring, ready to snap and shatter the mundane peace of the diner. Gun-woo saw it all. He saw the way the trafficker's knuckles whitened, and he saw Dorothy's oblivious smile as she reached for a pitcher. If he didn't act, the first blood spilled tonight would be hers. With a sudden, violent motion, Gun-woo slammed his heavy glass of ice water onto the table. The crack of glass against formica echoed like a gunshot, freezing every soul in the room. "Is this what passes for service here?" His voice boomed, a low, guttural roar that stripped the diner of its background noise. It was a calculated explosion of rage, a performance of the arrogant boss that demanded every eye in the building. Dorothy flinched, the pitcher trembling in her hand as she spun around, her eyes wide with shock. "Sir, is there a problem? The steak is cold, the water is stagnant, and your presence is an irritation." Gun-woo spat, standing up and towering over the table. He was loud, obnoxious, and utterly terrifying. He began a tirade about the quality of the establishment, waving his hands with a theatrical fury that forced the traffickers at table 12 to sink lower into their booth, trying to remain invisible while the most dangerous man in the room threw a tantrum. It was the perfect curtain. Under the cover of Gun-woo's manufactured storm, his men in the background finally moved. They didn't run. They drifted like smoke. One slid toward the kitchen exit. Another positioned himself by the heavy glass front doors, and Tony, the largest of the group, moved into the blind spot behind the trafficker's booth. The background was no longer a setting. It was a trap. Dorothy hurried toward table 8, stammering apologies, her movement pulling her safely away from the line of fire. Gun-woo's eyes never left the traffickers, even as he berated the waitress. He saw the confusion in the lead man's eyes, the uncertainty of whether this was a random outburst or a targeted strike. Lucia remained perfectly still, her small heart hammering against her ribs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The dragon had provided the distraction. The chess pieces were set. Now the board was about to break. The silence that followed Gun-woo's outburst was not a return to peace. It was the heavy, breathless quiet that precedes a landslide. Dorothy had scuttled back toward the kitchen, her apron fluttering like a white flag of surrender, leaving the center of the diner a hollowed-out arena. The traffickers at table 12 sat rigid, their bodies coiled in a desperate attempt to remain inconspicuous, but the shadows were no longer hiding them. Gun-woo remained standing, a monolith of scarred flesh and dark silk, his presence consuming the room's oxygen. Then the world shifted. As if governed by a single, invisible pulse, the men in the background stood up. There was no clatter of chairs, no hurried movements, just the synchronized rising of 6 obsidian figures. They moved with the terrifying economy of soldiers who had long ago traded their humanity for efficiency. To the average diner, they looked like a group of friends finishing a meal. To the men in the leather jackets, they were the closing jaws of a trap. The lead trafficker's head snapped to the left, then the right. His hand, still anchored to Lucia's shoulder, began to tremble. He saw Tony, a man built like a tombstone, blocking the path to the restroom. He saw the others fanning out, their dark blazers open just enough to reveal the cold, industrial gleam of hardware tucked into their waistbands. The biker gang, who had walked into the diner thinking they owned the night through sheer intimidation, suddenly felt the air thin. They were wolves who had accidentally wandered into a dragon's den. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They weren't just being watched. They were being harvested. The man holding Lucia looked up at Gunwoo, and for the first time, the predatory mask slipped, revealing a raw, jagged fear. He saw the tattoos on Gunwoo's hands, the ink-dark scales of the dragon that marked him as the sovereign of the city's darkest corners. These were not rival bikers. These were the men who dictated the price of life and death in every alleyway from here to the coast. Gunwoo didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silent siege was a psychological execution. He watched the sweat bead on the trafficker's forehead, watched the way the man's eyes darted toward the exit, only to find it barred by two men who looked like they were carved from granite. The power dynamic in the room had flipped so violently that the grease-stained walls seemed to groan under the pressure. Lucia felt the grip on her shoulder falter, the vice-like fingers losing their strength as her captor's focus shattered. The traffickers were no longer the biggest sharks in the room. They were bait. Gunwoo took a single, slow step toward table 12, the sound of his boot on the linoleum echoing like a gavel. He had spent his life building an empire on the fear of others, but tonight, he was using that fear for something that felt dangerously like justice. The trap was locked. The siege was complete. All that remained was the reckoning. Gunwoo crossed the distance between table 8 and table 12 with the slow, deliberate stride of a god descending into a pit of mortals. The linoleum didn't creak. It seemed to bow under the weight of his intent. By the time he reached the edge of their booth, the air had turned to ice. The lead trafficker, his face slick with a greasy sheen of sweat, tried to muster a final spark of bravado. He bared his teeth, but his eyes were wide, darting like trapped animals between Gunwoo and the circle of silent giants closing in around them. "You're in the wrong place, old man," the trafficker hissed, his voice cracking like dry wood. "We're just having a quiet meal. Move along before things get messy." Gunwoo didn't blink. He reached out his hand, mapped with the ink of 1,000 sins, and placed the crushed white towel on the table. He smoothed it out with a finger, revealing the word help in its jagged, purple glory. The gesture was terrifyingly domestic, yet it felt like the tolling of a funeral bell. "The girl asked for the check," Gunwoo said, his voice a low, tectonic rumble. "And I'm the one who settles the accounts in this city." The man's ego finally snapped. "To hell with this," he roared, lunging backward. His hand vanished into the folds of his leather jacket, emerging with the cold, black geometry of a semi-automatic. The diners who hadn't yet fled screamed, the sound lost in the sudden, sharp intake of breath that filled the room. The barrel leveled at Gunwoo's chest, a mere foot away. The dragon didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for his own weapon. Instead, he leaned forward, pressing his chest directly against the muzzle of the gun. The absolute, suicidal lack of fear was more paralyzing than any blade. Gunwoo looked the man in the eyes, his gaze a bottomless void of black glass. "Do it," Gunwoo whispered, a sound of pure, concentrated menace. "Pull the trigger, but know that before your shell hits the floor, my men will have turned everyone at this table into a memory." "Is this the hill you want to die on, little wolf?" The trafficker's finger trembled on the trigger. He looked past Gunwoo and saw Tony's massive hand already hovering over his throat, saw the other 5 blazers flared open, the hardware ready. The realization hit him. Gunwoo wasn't just a boss. He was an inevitability. The man's resolve crumbled. His arm began to shake, the weight of the gun becoming an impossible burden under the dragon's stare. In one blurring motion, Gunwoo's hand shot out. He didn't grab the gun. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with a sickening, audible crunch. The weapon clattered to the table, harmless and pathetic. With his other hand, Gunwoo reached out and gently, almost tenderly, brushed a stray braid away from Lucia's tear-stained face. The girl looked up at him, her red eyes wide with a dawning sense of safety. "Go to Dorotha," Gunwoo told her, his voice softening just enough to be heard only by her. "She has a kitchen to hide you in. I have a city to clean." As Lucia scrambled away, the dragon turned back to the broken men at the table. The white piece was a ghost. The business deal was a joke. He was Lee Gunwoo, and he had just reminded the world that some monsters don't live under the bed. They sit at the head of the table. The representative of the rival faction, a man named Park who had spent the last hour meticulously discussing percentages and port access, finally stood up. His face was a mask of calculated outrage, his expensive silk tie a sharp contrast to the violence staining the floor of the diner. He looked at the broken traffickers, then at the gun lying like a discarded toy on the table, and finally at Gun-woo. To Park, this wasn't a rescue. It was a breach of contract. Have you lost your mind, Gun-woo? Park's voice was a sharp, clinical blade. Those men belong to the Choi family. They are part of the logistics chain we just agreed to protect. You are throwing away a 10-year piece for a piece of street trash and a girl who doesn't even have a name. Gun-woo didn't look up from the table. He was still staring at the white towel, now stained with the grease of the diner and the sweat of a coward. He felt the weight of the $1 million treaty shifting in his mind, turning from a crown into a shackle. She has a name, Gun-woo said, his voice coming from a place deeper than his throat. Her name is Lucia, and in my city, she is more valuable than your docs. Park stepped closer, his shadow falling over the help, written in purple. This is business, not a movie. If you don't step back right now, if you don't hand that girl back to the Choi's associates and apologize, this treaty dies before the ink is dry. You'll be declaring war on 4 different families. You'll lose the docks. You'll lose the Miami route. You'll lose everything you've spent a decade building. The background men shifted. They knew the math. They knew that saving one girl meant burning down the empire they had bled to protect. They looked to Gun-woo, waiting for the cold, logical calculator they had followed for years to return. They expected him to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of a single life against $1 billion syndicate. Gun-woo slowly turned his head to look at Park. The scars on his face seemed to glow under the red neon of the open sign. For years, he had been a man who looked at the world and saw only assets and liabilities. But tonight, the red in Lucia's eyes had acted as a solvent, dissolving the nihilism that had kept him powerful but hollow. I spent my life building an empire so I would never have to take orders from men like you, Gun-woo said, standing up to his full, intimidating height. He picked up the signed treaty from table 8. The paper was crisp, expensive, and utterly meaningless. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it down the middle, then again until the white piece was nothing but a handful of confetti. He let the pieces flutter down onto the lead trafficker's groaning form. The deal is dead, Gun-woo announced, the sound of his voice marking the end of an era. Tell the Choice that the dragon is finished with treaties. From tonight, my organization has a new mandate. We are the ones who hunt the hunters. Park backed away, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. You've just started a war, Gun-woo. You'll be dead by sunrise. Then I'll see you in hell, Gun-woo replied. But Lucia goes home tonight, and that's a profit I can finally live with. The blue and red lights of the squad cars pulsed against the diner's windows, painting the interior in the rhythmic colors of a heartbeat. For the first time in his life, the arrival of the police did not signal a tactical retreat for Lee Gun-woo. He stood by the shattered remnants of Table 12, his hands buried deep in his pockets, watching as Dorothy led Lucia toward the door. The girl paused at the threshold, her small frame silhouetted against the night. She turned back, her wide, blue eyes finding Gun-woo's scarred face one last time. There was no fear left in them, only a silent, profound recognition of the monster who had chosen to be a man. She gave a single, solemn nod, a debt acknowledged, before disappearing into the safety of the sirens. The diner grew quiet as the authorities took the broken traffickers into custody. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending hit. It was the stillness of a vacuum waiting to be filled. Gun-woo felt the ghost of the white towel in his palm, the memory of that purple crayon, help, etched into his mind like a new tattoo. He realized that for 40 years, he had been building walls to protect a kingdom of ash, only to find that a single word from a child could burn it all down and leave something purer in the wreckage. He turned to face his men. Tony and the others stood in a semicircle, their expressions unreadable, their lives now tied to a war that had no profit margin. They had watched him tear up $1 million treaty for a girl who couldn't pay them a cent. In the cold logic of the underworld, Gunwoo had just committed professional suicide. But as he looked at them, he didn't see doubt. He saw the same spark that had been ignited in him, a hunger for a purpose that went deeper than territory. The docks are gone, Gunwoo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that commanded the room. The Miami route is closed. By tomorrow, every family in this city will be coming for our heads because we broke the one rule they all live by: mind your own business. He paused, his gaze raking over the ink-stained skin and hardened faces of his crew. But I'm done with their business. From this second, the dragon doesn't deal in shadow. We deal in light. He stepped toward the center of the diner, the red neon light of the open sign reflecting in his dark eyes. I want a list. Every warehouse, every shell company, every bottom feeder like the ones we just broke. If they touch a child, if they trade in souls, I want them erased. We aren't just a syndicate anymore. We are the reckoning. Tony stepped forward, the first to bridge the gap. He didn't ask about the money or the lost alliances. He simply nodded, his massive hand coming to rest over his heart in a gesture of absolute fealty. One by one, the others followed, a silent oath taken in a grease-stained diner at 3 in the morning. Gunwoo walked out into the night air, the cool breeze catching the scars on his face. He knew the war ahead would be brutal, and he knew he might not see the end of it. But as he looked up at the starless city sky, he felt a strange, terrifying peace. He had spent his life being the monster people feared in the dark. Now he would be the monster that the dark feared. The promise of the dragon was written in blood, but for the first time it was blood worth spilling. What did you think of this story, and do you have a Gunwoo in your life? Let us know in the comments below. Also, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.